My name is Ryan, and the night I caught my brother kissing my fiancée in our family's restaurant kitchen changed everything. But that betrayal was just the appetizer. What came next would destroy our family forever, and honestly, they had it coming. I should have seen it coming. The signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a gingerbread house made of lies. My brother Derek had always been the golden boy, the one who could charm his way out of any situation with that perfect smile and those piercing blue eyes that made everyone forget he was actually a snake in designer clothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Meanwhile, I was the guy who showed up early, stayed late, and somehow always ended up holding the bag when things went wrong. Sarah was supposed to be different. When I met her 3 years ago at that coffee shop on 5th Street, she was reading a book about sustainable architecture while sipping a lavender latte. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window, and when she looked up at me with those green eyes, I felt something shift in my chest. She was studying urban planning at the university, had this infectious laugh that made me want to be funnier, and she actually listened when I talked about my dreams of expanding our family restaurant into something bigger. Our family owned Romano's, a small Italian place that had been serving the same neighborhood for 37 years. My dad, Michael Romano, started it when he was barely 25, working 18-hour days with my mom, Linda, until they built something real, something that mattered. The red brick building on Maple Avenue had become a cornerstone of the community, the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family would celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, and first dates. Derek never cared about any of that. He saw Romano's as a stepping stone, a quaint little family business that he'd eventually leverage into something more profitable. He talked about franchising, about selling the recipes to larger chains, about maximizing brand potential. He had an MBA from State University and never let anyone forget it. Me, I had calloused hands from prep work and a genuine love for watching a customer's face light up when they tasted my grandmother's secret marinara recipe. Sarah understood that difference. During our first year together, she'd come by after her evening classes, sitting at the corner booth while I finished closing duties. She'd sketch renovation ideas on napkins, dreaming up ways to expand the dining room or add a small stage for local musicians. She saw the same potential I did, but she wanted to grow it organically, preserving what made Romano special instead of strip mining it for profit. The engagement happened on a Tuesday night in October. I'd closed the restaurant early, set up candles throughout the empty dining room, and cooked her favorite dish, my take on osso buco that I'd been perfecting for months. When I got down on one knee beside table 7, the same table where my parents had their first date, she said yes before I even finished asking the question. The ring wasn't huge, but it was real, just like everything else between us. Derek seemed happy for us, at least on the surface. He gave me a firm handshake, told Sarah she was getting a good man, and even offered to help plan the bachelor party. Looking back, that should have been the first red flag. Derek didn't do anything unless there was something in it for him, but I was too caught up in wedding planning and restaurant expansion to notice the way he lingered when he hugged her goodbye, or how his eyes followed her when she walked away. The second red flag was subtler. Sarah started mentioning Derek more often in conversation. Nothing dramatic, just casual references that seemed innocent enough. She'd mention how Derek had suggested a great vendor for wedding flowers, or how he'd given her advice about dealing with difficult professors. When I asked how they'd had time to discuss these things, she'd say they'd run into each other at the university, or that he'd stopped by her apartment to drop off something work-related. Derek had recently convinced our parents to let him handle more of the business side of Romano's. He'd presented this elaborate proposal about modernizing our operations, complete with charts and projections that made my dad's eyes glaze over with confusion and my mom nod approvingly. Suddenly, Derek was in charge of vendor relationships, marketing strategies, and financial planning. I was still head chef and floor manager, but Derek controlled the money and the future direction of the restaurant. The third red flag was the phone calls. Sarah's phone would buzz at odd hours and she'd glance at it with this expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked who it was, she'd say it was work or her sister or some other explanation that felt just plausible enough to accept. But the timing was always strange, like when we were having dinner or watching a movie, moments when most people wouldn't interrupt unless it was important. I started noticing other changes too. Sarah would sometimes smell different when she came home from study sessions, wearing a cologne that wasn't mine. She developed new opinions about business strategies that sounded suspiciously similar to Derek's philosophies about growth and expansion. When we discussed wedding plans, she'd suggest venues that were outside our budget. Places that Derek had mentioned were investment opportunities for young couples starting their lives together. The fourth red flag was the most obvious, but somehow I managed to rationalize it away. Derek started showing up at places where Sarah and I were supposed to be alone. If we went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, Derek would mysteriously appear claiming he was sourcing ingredients for a new menu item. If we went to see a movie, Derek would be there with some story about meeting a potential business partner who'd stood him up. Every time Sarah would seem genuinely surprised to see him, and Derek would play the role of the apologetic brother who didn't want to intrude. But they never seemed to mind when he stayed. The breaking point came on a Thursday night in March. Sarah had been acting distant for weeks, claiming she was stressed about final exams in her thesis project. She'd canceled 3 dinner dates in a row, saying she needed to spend more time in the library. I'd offered to bring her food, to study with her, to do whatever she needed, but she insisted she worked better alone. That Thursday I'd planned to surprise her. I'd left Romano's early, picked up her favorite Thai takeout and driven to her apartment with the intention of creating a quiet study break where we could reconnect. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old Victorian house that had been converted into student housing. The stairs always creaked, so I expected her to hear me coming, but when I reached her door the apartment was silent. I knocked softly, not wanting to startle her if she was deep in concentration. No answer. I tried the handle and the door was unlocked, which wasn't unusual since Sarah often forgot to lock up when she was home studying. I pushed the door open, expecting to find her hunched over textbooks at her kitchen table, but the main room was empty. That's when I heard the voices coming from her bedroom. Not just voices, laughter, low intimate conversation that made my stomach drop before my brain could fully process what I was hearing. I stood frozen in her living room, takeout bags growing heavy in my hands, listening to my fiancé and my brother talking in the next room like they'd done this 100 times before. "We can't keep doing this," Sarah was saying, but her voice didn't sound upset. It sounded regretful, like someone who knew they should stop eating dessert but couldn't help reaching for another bite. "I know," Derek replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "But we're not hurting anyone if we're careful." Ryan's so focused on the restaurant that he barely notices what's happening right in front of him. The takeout bag slipped from my hands, landing on the hardwood floor with a soft thud. Inside that bedroom, the conversation stopped. I heard movement, whispered urgency, the sound of people trying to make themselves presentable in a hurry. Part of me wanted to run, to pretend I'd never heard anything, to go back to my car and drive until I reached a place where none of this was real. Instead, I walked toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see them sitting on the edge. They weren't naked, but their clothes were disheveled in a way that told a clear story. Derek's shirt was unbuttoned, Sarah's hair was messed up, and they both had that flushed look of people who'd been interrupted in the middle of something they shouldn't have been doing. When I pushed the door open, they both looked up with expressions of shock that quickly morphed into guilt and panic. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. Derek just stared at me with those blue eyes that suddenly seemed cold and calculating instead of charming. "Ryan," Sarah whispered, and I could hear her trying to find words that would explain this away, some story that would make sense of what I was seeing. I didn't give her the chance. "How long?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm considering that my entire world was crumbling around me. Derek stood up slowly, buttoning his shirt with deliberate movements. "Ryan, this isn't what it looks like." "How long?" I repeated, looking directly at Sarah this time. She couldn't meet my eyes. 2 months, she whispered. 2 months. 8 weeks of looking me in the face every day, planning our wedding, talking about our future while she was sleeping with my brother behind my back. 8 weeks of family dinners where Derek would joke about being the best man at our wedding while secretly knowing he was destroying it from the inside. "Why?" The question came out broken, barely audible. Derek answered before Sarah could respond. "Because she deserves someone who can give her more than a lifetime of serving pasta to strangers. Someone with actual ambition." That's when the calm facade cracked. I took a step toward Derek, my hands clenching into fists, but Sarah moved between us. "Please don't," she said, tears streaming down her face. "This is all my fault. Derek was just trying to help me figure out what I really wanted." "What you really wanted," I repeated slowly, tasting the bitterness of those words. "And what you really wanted was him." She nodded, unable to speak. I pulled the engagement ring from my pocket, the one I'd been carrying around to get resized at the jewelry store, and set it on her dresser. Then I looked at Derek, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never noticed before. There was no guilt in his expression, no remorse, just satisfaction, like he'd won a game I hadn't even known we were playing. "Congratulations," I said quietly. "You deserve each other." I walked out of that apartment and drove straight to Romano's even though we were closed for the night. I let myself in through the back door and sat in the kitchen where I'd spent countless hours learning my grandmother's recipes, where I'd planned my future with Sarah, where I'd dreamed about the life we were going to build together. The restaurant felt different that night. Smaller somehow, like it had shrunk to accommodate the weight of what I'd lost. I sat there until dawn, thinking about the engagement ring on Sarah's dresser, about the wedding we'd been planning, about the way Derek had looked at me with those satisfied eyes. But mostly I thought about what Derek had said, that Sarah deserved someone with actual ambition, someone who could give her more than a lifetime serving pasta to strangers. The irony was that Derek was right, just not in the way he thought. Sarah did deserve someone with ambition, someone who could build something lasting and meaningful, someone who understood the difference between success and worth. She just picked the wrong brother. Over the next few weeks, the news of our broken engagement spread through our small community like wildfire. Sarah and Derek made no effort to hide their relationship, appearing together at university events and family gatherings with a boldness that bordered on shameless. My parents were devastated not just by the betrayal but by the way it had torn our family apart. My mom stopped speaking to Derek entirely while my dad tried unsuccessfully to play peacemaker. The worst part was watching how Derek handled the situation. He acted like he'd rescued Sarah from a terrible fate, like he'd done everyone a favor by revealing that she and I weren't meant to be together. He'd put his arm around her at family dinners, making casual jokes about dodging bullets and finding true love when you least expect it. Sarah would laugh along, but I caught her watching me sometimes with an expression that might have been regret. 3 weeks after I caught them together, Derek announced that he was taking a more active role in Romano's business operations. He'd apparently been working on expansion plans during his secret relationship, and now he was ready to implement them. The proposal was ambitious: franchise the Romano's brand, open 3 new locations within 2 years, and eventually sell the whole operation to a larger restaurant group for a projected 7-figure payout. My parents were intrigued despite everything. The restaurant had been struggling financially since the pandemic, and Derek's projections showed a path to not just recovery but genuine wealth. He'd prepared professional presentations complete with market analysis and financial forecasts that made our little family restaurant sound like the next Olive Garden. I tried to raise concerns about losing the personal touch that made Romano's special, about alienating our loyal customer base, about the risk of expanding too quickly. But Derek dismissed my objections as emotional responses from someone who couldn't see the bigger picture. He had spreadsheets and business school theories. I had intuition and 30 years of watching my family build something beautiful from nothing. The family vote was scheduled for a Friday night in April. We'd close the restaurant early and meet in the back dining room to decide the future of Romano's. Derek would present his expansion plan, I'd present my alternative vision for organic growth, and my parents would choose which direction to take the business that had been their life's work. I spent the week preparing my presentation, but I knew I was fighting an uphill battle. Derek had the advantage of professional polish and financial projections that promised my parents a comfortable retirement. My plan was more conservative, more focused on maintaining quality and community connections, and it probably looked small and unambitious compared to Derek's grand vision. The night before the meeting, I was closing up Romano's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. "Is this Ryan Romano?" The voice was gravelly, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "Yes, who's asking?" "My name is Frank Castellano. I used to be your grandmother's business partner back before she married your grandfather." I sat down hard in the knee. My grandmother had died when I was 12, and I'd never heard anyone mention a business partner from her early days. "I don't understand," I said slowly. "Your grandmother Maria, she was a smart woman, smarter than anyone gave her credit for. When she married Vincent and started the restaurant, she made some arrangements, legal arrangements, to protect what she'd built from people who might not understand its real value." "What kind of arrangements?" Frank chuckled, but it wasn't a happy sound. "The kind that your brother doesn't know about. The kind that might interest you, considering what I've been hearing about his plans for Romano's." "How do you know about Derek's plans?" "I know a lot of things, kid, including the fact that your grandmother left something for you. Something she made me promise to keep safe until the right time came along." My heart was racing. "What kind of something?" "The kind of something that proves Romano's isn't just your family's restaurant, it's your restaurant. Legally, officially, and completely." "I don't understand what you're talking about." "Meet me tomorrow morning at 10. Riverside Park by the old pavilion."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bring identification and come alone. It's time you learned the truth about what your grandmother really left you. The line went dead, leaving me sitting in the empty restaurant with more questions than answers. I tried calling the number back, but it went straight to voicemail. I sat there for another hour staring at the photos on the walls of Romano's, pictures of my grandparents, my parents, and 3 generations of customers who'd become like family.
Whatever Frank Castellano had to tell me, whatever my grandmother had left behind, I knew it was going to change everything. The only question was whether it would change things in my favor or make an already complicated situation even worse. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about my grandmother Maria, trying to remember conversations we'd had before she died. She'd always been protective of the restaurant, more so than my grandfather Vincent, who was content to let things run their natural course. Maria was the one who insisted on keeping detailed records of everything, who maintained relationships with suppliers and customers long after most people would have delegated those responsibilities. She was also the one who'd taught me to cook, spending hours in the kitchen showing me how to balance flavors and read the subtle signs that told you when a sauce was ready. My grandfather had taught Derek basic business principles, but Maria had taught me the soul of cooking, the intuitive understanding that turned good ingredients into something magical. If she'd left me something, some legal document or business arrangement that Frank Castellano had been keeping safe, it meant she'd seen something in me that others had missed. Just like she'd seen potential in a small Italian restaurant when everyone else told her it would never work. The next morning I arrived at Riverside Park 15 minutes early, but Frank was already there. He was exactly what I'd expected from his voice, maybe 70 years old, wearing a well-maintained but old-fashioned suit, sitting on a bench feeding pigeons from a small bag of breadcrumbs. When he saw me approaching, he stood and extended his hand. "You look like her," he said simply. "Same eyes, same stubborn jaw." "Mr. Castellano, I appreciate you calling, but I have to ask, how do I know you're telling the truth about knowing my grandmother?" He smiled and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a faded photograph. It showed a young woman I barely recognized as my grandmother standing outside a small storefront with a man who was clearly a younger version of Frank. They were both wearing aprons and holding up a banner that read Castellano and Romano Catering opening soon. "We were partners for 3 years, Frank said, settling back onto the bench. "This was before she met your grandfather, before Romano's existed. We had a little catering business, mostly weddings and community events. Maria handled the cooking, I handled the business side." I studied the photograph, trying to reconcile the young woman in the picture with the grandmother I remembered. What happened to the partnership? Life happened. She fell in love with Vincent, and he didn't much like the idea of his wife having a business partner. So we dissolved the partnership, but Maria was smart. She insisted on certain legal protections, certain documents that would preserve her rights if anything ever happened to Vincent or if the family business was ever threatened. Frank reached into a leather satchel beside the bench and pulled out a manila envelope sealed with wax. "She made me promise to give this to her grandson if 2 conditions were met. First, if someone tried to take Romanos away from the family, and second, if that grandson had proven himself worthy of her legacy." "How do you know I've proven myself worthy?" "Because you're here instead of in some corporate boardroom planning how to strip mine your family's restaurant for parts. Because you've spent the last 10 years working in that kitchen, learning those recipes, treating customers like family instead of profit centers." He handed me the envelope. "Also because Maria told me you would be. She said you had her hands for cooking and her heart for family. She said when the time came you'd be the one who understood what Romanos really meant." I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling the weight of whatever was inside. "What about Derek?" Frank's expression hardened slightly. "Maria saw Derek too. She loved him, but she wasn't blind to what he was. She used to say that Derek had Vincent's charm but none of his loyalty. She worried about what would happen if Derek ever got control of the restaurant. So whatever's in here, whatever's in there gives you legal ownership of Romanos, independent of whatever arrangements your parents might make with Derek. Maria transferred her share of the business to a trust with you as the sole beneficiary, but the transfer was structured to activate only under specific circumstances." I broke the wax seal and opened the envelope. Inside were several legal documents, all bearing official stamps and notary seals. The language was dense and legal, but the core message was clear. My grandmother had retained a controlling interest in Romanos through a complex trust arrangement, and that interest was now mine. "There's more," Frank said quietly. "Maria didn't just leave you the restaurant, she left you the means to protect it. Look at the last document." The final paper in the envelope was different from the others. It was a contract signed by my grandmother and witnessed by 2 lawyers, establishing a consulting arrangement with Frank's company. According to the document, Frank Castellano was authorized to act as a business advisor for Romanos, with full access to financial records and the authority to investigate any irregularities in the restaurant's operations. "I've been watching Derek's activities for the past 6 months," Frank said matter-of-factly. Your grandmother asked me to keep an eye on the business after Vincent died, just in case someone tried to take advantage. And what did you find? Frank's smile was grim. Your brother's been skimming money from Romano's accounts to fund his expansion plans. Small amounts at first, but it's accelerated recently. He's also been setting up shell companies and moving restaurant assets into his personal name, positioning himself to own the Romano's brand even if your parents decide against franchising. The documents in my hand suddenly felt heavier. Do you have proof? Bank records, incorporation documents, financial transfers, everything you need to prove that Derek's been systematically stealing from your family while planning to sell your grandmother's legacy to the highest bidder. I stared at the papers, thinking about the family meeting scheduled for that evening, about Derek's confident presentation and my parents' hopeful faces. They had no idea that the son they were trusting to expand their business had already been robbing them blind. What do I do with this information? Frank stood up, brushing breadcrumbs from his suit. That's up to you, kid. You could confront Derek privately, give him a chance to return the money and walk away quietly. You could expose him publicly and let the legal system handle it. Or you could be smart about it. What do you mean be smart about it? Your grandmother was a patient woman. She understood that sometimes the best revenge is letting people destroy themselves while you protect what really matters. Derek's put himself in a vulnerable position with all this illegal activity. The question is, what are you going to do with that vulnerability? Frank picked up his satchel and started walking toward the parking lot, leaving me alone on the bench with a manila envelope full of dynamite. As he reached his car, he called back to me. One more thing, Ryan. Your grandmother left you a message. She said to tell you that Romano's was never about the building or the money. It was about creating something that would outlast all of us. Don't let anyone convince you that success means giving up what makes it special. I sat in the park for another hour, reading through the documents and trying to process what I'd learned. My grandmother had seen this coming somehow, had anticipated that Derek might try to take control of Romano's, and she'd created a safety net to protect both the restaurant and me. But more than that, she'd given me a choice. I could use this information to simply stop Derek's plans, or I could use it to take control of my own destiny. The legal documents made it clear that I now owned Romano's, but they also gave me the authority to investigate Derek's activities and take action to recover the stolen money. By the time I drove back to Romano's for the afternoon prep, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to confront Derek at the family meeting. I wasn't going to expose him publicly or create a dramatic scene that would tear my family apart even further. Instead, I was going to be patient. I was going to let Derek present his expansion plan, let him reveal more of his illegal activities, and let him dig his own grave deeper while I gathered the evidence I needed to bury him completely. My grandmother had taught me that good cooking required patience, that you couldn't rush the process without ruining the final product. Tonight, I was going to start cooking the most important meal of my life, and Derek was going to be the main course. That Friday evening, the back dining room of Romano's felt like a courtroom. The round table that usually hosted birthday celebrations and anniversary dinners had been transformed into a battlefield where the future of our family's legacy would be decided. My parents sat at opposite ends, my mother clutching a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, my father reviewing Derek's typed proposal for what must have been the 10th time that day. Derek arrived precisely at 7, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the navy suit he reserved for important occasions. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd already won, settling into his chair and arranging his materials with practiced efficiency. Sarah wasn't with him, a small mercy that I silently appreciated. Facing my brother's betrayal was difficult enough without having to look at the woman who'd been planning our wedding while sleeping with him behind my back. I sat across from Derek, my own folder much thinner than his elaborate presentation. Inside were 3 things: my grandmother's trust documents, Frank Castellano's business card, and a single sheet of paper outlining my vision for Romano's future. I decided to let Derek present first, to give him enough rope to hang himself while I observed and learned exactly how deep his deception ran. My father cleared his throat and looked around the table. Before we start, I want everyone to remember that we're family first, business partners second. Whatever we decide tonight, we're still the people who've shared Sunday dinners for 30 years. His voice carried the weight of a man trying to hold his world together with words and hope. Derek smiled, the same charming expression that had convinced our parents to trust him with the restaurant's finances. Dad's absolutely right. This is about building something bigger for all of us, about taking Romano's to the next level while honoring everything Grandma and Grandpa created. He opened his briefcase and pulled out bound copies of his proposal, sliding them across the table to each of us. The cover page was professionally designed, featuring the Romano's logo reimagined with sleek modern fonts and the tagline, "Authentic Italian, Elevated Experience." The restaurant industry has changed dramatically in the past 5 years, Derek began, falling into his presentation voice. Customers want consistency, convenience, and value. They want to know that Romano's in downtown will taste exactly like Romano's in the suburbs, and they want to be able to order online, get delivery, and earn loyalty points just like they do at the big chains. My mother nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the professional polish of Derek's materials. The proposal included market research, competitor analysis, and financial projections that painted a picture of unlimited growth potential. According to Derek's numbers, Romano's could become a regional brand within 3 years and go national within 5. The initial investment for franchising is substantial, Derek continued, but I've already secured preliminary commitments from investors who believe in our brand. We're looking at opening locations in 3 neighboring cities first, then expanding systematically based on market demand and profitability metrics. He flipped through charts showing projected revenues, staffing models, and standardized menu offerings. Everything was color-coded and cross-referenced, the kind of presentation that made small business ownership look simple and profitable. Derek had clearly spent months preparing this proposal, probably with Sarah's help during their secret evening meetings. The beauty of franchising, Derek said, warming to his subject, is that we maintain control of the brand while other people invest their money and take the operational risks. We collect franchise fees, royalties, and licensing revenue without having to manage day-to-day operations at multiple locations. My father was asking technical questions about licensing agreements and territory restrictions, questions that Derek answered with the fluency of someone who'd done extensive research. My mother wanted to know about quality control and training programs, concerns that Derek addressed with detailed explanations about standardized recipes and certified training protocols. I listened to it all, taking notes and watching Derek's performance with new eyes. Everything he said sounded reasonable, even exciting, but I kept thinking about Frank Castellano's warning about shell companies and moved assets. Derek was presenting himself as the family's savior, but his real agenda was far more personal and much more destructive. After 45 minutes of charts and projections, Derek reached his conclusion. The bottom line is this: we can either stay small and struggle to compete with national chains, or we can become a national chain ourselves. The Romano name has value, our recipes have value, and our reputation has value. It's time to monetize those assets and build the kind of wealth that will secure our family's future for generations. The room fell silent as Derek closed his folder and leaned back in his chair. My parents exchanged glances, clearly overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing. The numbers were impressive, the logic seemed sound, and Derek had answers for every objection they'd raised. "Ryan," my father said quietly, "what do you think about Derek's proposal?" This was my moment. I could have pulled out the trust documents and exposed Derek's theft immediately, ending his presentation and his schemes in one dramatic revelation. Instead, I chose a different approach. "I think Derek's put together an impressive presentation," I said carefully. "The financial projections are certainly ambitious, and he's clearly done extensive research into the franchising model." Derek's eyebrows rose slightly, as if he'd been expecting me to argue against his plan, and was surprised by my measured response. "However," I continued, "I have some concerns about implementation and timing. Before we make such a significant decision, I think we need to thoroughly understand our current financial position and make sure we're not taking on more risk than we can handle." My mother nodded approvingly. "That's very sensible, Ryan. What exactly are you thinking?" I opened my thin folder and pulled out Frank Castellano's business card. "I'd like to suggest that we hire an independent financial consultant to review our books and assess Derek's proposal from an objective perspective. Someone with experience in restaurant franchising, who can verify these projections and identify any potential problems before we commit to anything." Derek's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "That's probably unnecessary, Ryan. I've already had the numbers reviewed by business school professors and industry consultants. Adding another layer of analysis will just delay our timeline and cost money we don't need to spend. Actually, I said, maintaining my calm tone, I've already identified a consultant who's willing to work for a very reasonable fee. Frank Castellano has 40 years of experience in restaurant operations and business development. He knew Grandma back when she was starting Romano's, so he understands our history and values. The flicker in Derek's expression became a full frown. I've never heard Grandma mention anyone named Frank Castellano. That's probably because their business relationship ended before you were born, I replied. But he's kept track of Romano's over the years, and he's offered to review our situation as a favor to Grandma's memory. My father was intrigued. What kind of review are you talking about, Ryan? A complete financial audit, including cash flow analysis, asset valuation and debt assessment, plus an objective evaluation of Derek's franchising proposal to make sure we understand all the risks and obligations involved. Derek leaned forward, his friendly demeanor cooling noticeably. Ryan, I appreciate your caution, but bringing in outside consultants sends the wrong message to potential investors. It suggests we don't have confidence in our own business plan. Or it suggests we're responsible business owners who do due diligence before making major decisions, I countered. If Derek's proposal is as solid as it appears, an independent review will only strengthen our position with investors.
My mother was nodding again. Ryan makes a good point. We've never made a decision this big without getting outside advice. Remember when we renovated the kitchen? We had 3 contractors review the plans before we chose one. This is different, Derek said, an edge creeping into his voice. We're talking about a time-sensitive opportunity. The investors I've lined up won't wait indefinitely while we second-guess ourselves. I pulled out my single sheet of paper and placed it on the table. Which brings me to my alternative proposal. Instead of rushing into franchising, I suggest we focus on maximizing the profitability of our existing location first. We could expand our catering services, develop a meal kit delivery program, and create branded products that customers can purchase online. Derek laughed, but it sounded forced. Ryan, that's thinking small. Meal kits and catering services might generate a few $1,000s in additional revenue per month. We're talking about building a multi-million-dollar empire. We're talking about building sustainable growth that doesn't require us to give up control of our family's restaurant, I replied. Your franchising model means other people will be cooking Grandma's recipes in kitchens we don't supervise, serving customers we'll never meet, using ingredients we can't control. That's what quality control systems are for, Derek said impatiently. We'll have strict standards and regular inspections to ensure brand consistency. And what happens when a franchisee cuts corners to increase profits? When they use cheaper ingredients or skip steps in Grandma's recipes? When customers associate the Romano name with mediocre food and poor service at locations we don't directly manage? My father was paying close attention now, clearly troubled by the scenarios I was describing. Ryan raises valid concerns, Derek. How do we protect our reputation if we're not directly involved in day-to-day operations? Derek's composure was starting to crack. Dad, every successful restaurant brand faces these challenges. McDonald's doesn't taste exactly the same at every location, but they're still the most successful restaurant company in the world. But McDonald's isn't a family business built on personal relationships and handcrafted recipes, I said quietly. Romano's success has always been based on quality, consistency, and the personal touch that comes from family ownership. How do we maintain that personal touch when we're managing dozens of franchisees, instead of focusing on our own customers? The questions were hitting their mark. My parents were starting to see the potential downsides of Derek's grand vision, the risks he'd glossed over in his polished presentation. Derek was clearly frustrated by the direction of the conversation, but he was trying to maintain his professional demeanor. Look, Derek said, forcing his voice back to its earlier confident tone, every business opportunity involves risk. The question is whether we want to take calculated risks that could make us wealthy, or play it safe and watch our competitors pass us by. Actually, I said, reaching for Frank's business card again, I think the question is whether we want to make decisions based on complete information or incomplete information, which is why I really think we should have Mr. Castellano review our finances before we move forward with any expansion plans. Derek's mask finally slipped completely. Ryan, I don't understand why you're so determined to bring in some stranger to second-guess decisions we're perfectly capable of making ourselves. Because I want to make sure we understand exactly where Romano stands financially before we commit to anything, I said,
meeting his eyes directly. I want to know our real cash flow, our actual assets and our genuine debt obligations. I want to make sure every dollar that belongs to Romanos is properly accounted for. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between confusion and panic. My parents looked back and forth between us, sensing an undercurrent they didn't understand. What exactly are you implying, Ryan? Derek asked slowly. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating clearly that I think we need a comprehensive financial review before making any major business decisions. Is there some reason you'd object to that level of transparency? Derek's hands clenched on the table. Of course not. I just think it's unnecessary and potentially harmful to our timeline. Then you won't mind if I contact Mr. Castellano tomorrow and ask him to begin his review immediately, I said, already reaching for my phone. In fact, why don't I call him right now and set up a meeting for Monday morning? Ryan, wait, Derek said quickly. Maybe we should discuss this privately before involving outside consultants. But I was already dialing Frank's number. The phone rang twice before his gravelly voice answered. Frank Castellano, Mr. Castellano, this is Ryan Romano. We met this morning about my grandmother's business arrangements. Of course, Ryan. How did your family meeting go? I looked directly at Derek as I spoke. It's actually still in progress. I was wondering if you might be available to conduct that financial review we discussed. As soon as possible. I can be at Romano's first thing Monday morning. Will you need me to examine records going back several years? Yes, please. I'd like a complete audit of our financial activity for the past 3 years, including all bank accounts, business transactions, and asset transfers. Derek's face had gone pale. Ryan, hang up the phone. We need to talk about this as a family before involving outsiders. But Frank was still talking. Ryan, based on what I observed during my preliminary research, I'd recommend examining payroll records, vendor payments, and any recent changes in business registration or ownership structure. Sometimes people try to hide financial irregularities in routine business transactions. That sounds very thorough, I said, watching Derek's increasingly panicked expression. Should I have our accounting records ready for your review? Absolutely. Bank statements, tax returns, payroll records, vendor contracts, and any legal documents related to business operations. The more complete the records, the more accurate my assessment will be. Derek stood up abruptly. Ryan, I said, hang up the phone. This conversation is over. But I wasn't finished. Mr. Castellano, is there anything specific I should look for when gathering those records? Any red flags that might indicate financial irregularities? Frank's chuckle was audible across the room. Well, unauthorized transfers to personal accounts, payments to shell companies, discrepancies between reported income and actual deposits, unusual patterns in vendor payments. You know, the kind of things people do when they think no one's paying attention. Derek lunged across the table, trying to grab my phone, but I was faster. I stood and stepped back, continuing my conversation, while Derek glared at me with undisguised fury. Those are exactly the kinds of things we want to identify, I said, calmly. We'll have everything ready for your review on Monday morning. Excellent. And Ryan, don't let anyone remove or alter any records between now and Monday. Sometimes people get nervous when they know an audit is coming. I understand completely. Thank you, Mr. Castellano. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Derek was breathing heavily, his careful composure completely shattered. My parents were staring at both of us with expressions of growing alarm. What the hell was that about? Derek demanded. That was about making sure Romano's financial records are properly reviewed before we make any major business decisions, I replied evenly. Exactly what I said it was about. Derek's laugh was bitter and angry. You're sabotaging this opportunity out of jealousy. You can't stand that I've found a way to make Romano successful, so you're trying to derail everything with pointless bureaucracy. Actually, I said, pulling the trust documents from my folder, I'm trying to protect Romanos from someone who's been systematically stealing from our family for months. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. My parents stared at me in shock, while Derek's face cycled through several emotions before settling on rage. That's a serious accusation, Ryan, my father said quietly. Do you have evidence to support it? I placed the trust documents on the table, spreading them out so everyone could see the official seals and legal language. These documents established that Grandma retained controlling ownership of Romanos through a legal trust arrangement. That trust was transferred to me upon her death, making me the legal owner of this restaurant. Derek's voice was strangled. That's impossible. Grandma never mentioned any trust arrangement. Grandma was a smart woman who understood the importance of protecting what she'd built. I continued. She also appointed Frank Castellano as a business consultant with authority to investigate any irregularity in Romano's operations. I pulled out a second set of papers, copies of the bank records Frank had prepared. Mr. Castellano has been monitoring our financial activity for the past 6 months. He's documented systematic theft of restaurant funds, unauthorized transfers to personal accounts, and the creation of shell companies designed to steal Romano's assets. My mother's cup slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor and sending coffee across the room. My father just stared at the documents, his face aging 10 years into. Derek's response was immediate and vicious. This is all fabricated. Ryan's working with some con artist to steal Romanos from our family. He's jealous of Sarah, jealous of my success, and now he's trying to destroy everything we've built. The bank records are real, Derek, I said quietly. The shell companies are real. The unauthorized transfers are real. Mr. Castellano has documentation going back 18 months, showing exactly how you've been stealing from Mom and Dad while pretending to help them expand the business. Derek looked around the table desperately, searching for allies who were no longer there. You have to understand, everything I did was for the family. I was positioning Romanos for growth, moving assets into more efficient corporate structures. You were stealing, I said simply. You were taking money that belonged to our parents and using it to fund your personal projects. Money that Mom and Dad needed for retirement, for healthcare, for the security they've earned after 37 years of building this business. My father's voice was barely a whisper. How much money, Derek? Derek's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him. It's not what you think, Dad. I was going to pay it all back once the franchising deal went through. The money was just temporary loans to cover startup costs. How much money? My father repeated, louder this time. Derek looked at the floor. About $400,000 over the past 2 years. My mother made a sound like she'd been punched in the stomach. My father just stared at his son with an expression of complete devastation. $400,000, my father said slowly. That's more money than your mother and I have saved for retirement. That's more money than this restaurant makes in profit most years. I was going to pay it back. Derek said desperately. The franchising deal would have generated enough revenue to cover everything and make the family wealthy. This was all part of a larger business strategy. What about Sarah? I asked quietly. Was she part of your larger business strategy too? Derek's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with renewed anger. Leave Sarah out of this. What happened between us has nothing to do with the restaurant, doesn't it? You started your relationship with my fiancée. Around the same time you accelerated your theft from Romano's accounts. You convinced her that I lacked ambition while you were using stolen money to fund your ambitious expansion plans. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Derek hadn't just stolen my fiancée and my family's money, he'd used one thing enable the other, convincing Sarah that he was the successful brother by spending funds he'd stolen from our parents. Sarah believes in me because I showed her a vision of real success, Derek said defiantly. I showed her what Romanos could become with proper leadership and ambitious planning. You showed her what Romanos could become if you successfully stole it from our family, I corrected. Every impressive business plan, every confident projection, every expensive dinner and romantic gesture was funded by money you stole from Mom and Dad. Derek's facade cracked completely. At least I was trying to build something. At least I had the courage to think bigger than serving the same 12 customers every night for the rest of my life. You were content to stay small and mediocre forever. I was content to stay honest, I said simply. The silence that followed was profound. My parents sat in their chairs looking like survivors of a natural disaster, trying to process the complete destruction of everything they believed about their older son. Derek stood at the head of the table, his expensive suit and confident demeanor revealed as costumes worn by a thief. Finally my father spoke. Derek, you need to leave Romano's tonight. Don't come back until you've returned every penny you stole from us. Derek's voice was desperate. Dad, please. Let me explain the full business plan. Once you understand the complete strategy, you'll see that everything I did was necessary for our success. Everything you did was theft, my father said firmly. You stole from your own family. You betrayed our trust. You used our money to convince Ryan's fiancée to leave him for you. There's no business plan that justifies that level of deception. Derek looked around the table one more time, perhaps hoping to find some sympathy or support, but there was none. My mother wouldn't even look at him. My father's expression was carved from stone. I simply waited, holding the documents that proved his guilt. "This isn't over," Derek said finally. "I'll fight this. I'll prove that Ryan's working with criminals to steal Romanos from our family." "Actually," I said, standing up and gathering the trust documents, "this is over. You're no longer welcome at Romano's, you're no longer part of our business operations. And if you don't return the stolen money within 30 days, I'll be turning these financial records over to the district attorney." Derek slammed his briefcase shut and headed for the door, but he paused before leaving. "You think you've won something, Ryan? You think destroying me will bring Sarah back? She chose me because I'm everything you'll never be. Ambitious, successful, willing to take risks to build something meaningful. She chose you because you convinced her with stolen money that you were successful," I replied calmly. "When that money's gone and you're facing criminal charges for embezzlement, we'll see how ambitious and successful she finds you." Derek left without another word, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. The three of us sat in the sudden quiet, processing what had just happened and what it meant for our family's future. My mother finally spoke, her voice small and broken. "How long have you known?" "I found out this morning," I said gently. "Frank Castellano contacted me yesterday and gave me the trust documents today." I wanted to let Derek present his proposal first to see how far he was willing to go with his deception. My father was studying the financial records, his expression growing more troubled with each page. $400,000. How did we not notice that much money missing? "Derek's good at what he does," I said. "He spread the theft over 2 years, disguised it as legitimate business expenses, and he's the one who handles our accounting. You trusted him to manage the finances honestly." My mother was crying quietly, not from sadness but from the kind of exhaustion that comes from having your world turned upside down in a single evening. "What happens now, Ryan? Can we recover the money? Can we save the restaurant?" I looked around the dining room where 3 generations of our family had celebrated milestones and weathered crises together. The walls were covered with photos of customers who'd become friends, employees who'd become family, and community events that had made Romano's more than just a business. "We're going to be fine," I said, meaning it completely. "The trust documents give us legal protection. Frank Castellano will help us recover the stolen funds, and Romano's is going to continue serving this community just like Grandma and Grandpa intended." My father managed a weak smile. "And Derek's franchising plans?" "Derek's franchising plans died the moment he chose theft over honesty," I said. "But that doesn't mean Romano's can't grow and evolve. We just need to do it the right way, with integrity and respect for what Grandma built." As we began cleaning up the scattered papers and broken coffee cup, I thought about the conversation I'd need to have with Frank Castellano on Monday morning. There would be legal procedures to follow, financial records to organize, and probably criminal charges to file against Derek. But tonight, for the first time in months, Romano's felt like home again. The weekend passed in a blur of phone calls, document organization, and difficult conversations. Frank Castellano arrived Monday morning exactly as promised, carrying a briefcase full of legal forms and a laptop loaded with financial analysis software. He spent 6 hours reviewing our records, occasionally muttering under his breath in what sounded like a mixture of admiration and disgust. "Your grandmother was brilliant," he told me as he finished his preliminary review. "The trust structure she created is airtight. Derek can't challenge your ownership of Romano's, and he can't claim any legal right to the assets he's stolen." We were sitting in the restaurant's office, surrounded by bank statements, canceled checks, and accounting ledgers that told the story of Derek's systematic theft. Frank had organized everything into neat piles, each representing a different aspect of Derek's criminal activity. "The shell companies are particularly clever," Frank continued. "Derek created 3 separate business entities, all with names similar enough to Romano's suppliers that casual observers wouldn't notice the difference. He'd write checks to these fake companies, then transfer the money to his personal accounts." I studied the documentation Frank had prepared, trying to understand the full scope of my brother's betrayal. "How much of the money can we recover?" "Most of it eventually. Derek hasn't had time to spend $400,000, and much of it is still sitting in accounts we can trace. We'll need to work with law enforcement to freeze his assets, but I'm confident we can recover at least 3/4 of what he stole." Frank pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop showing Derek's financial activity over the past 2 years. The pattern was clear: small thefts at first, growing larger and more frequent as Derek became more confident in his ability to avoid detection. "The interesting thing," Frank said, "is that Derek's theft accelerated significantly around the same time he started his relationship with your former fiancée. He was spending money on expensive restaurants, jewelry, weekend trips to wine country, all funded by money stolen from your parents." The irony was bitter but undeniable. Derek had convinced Sarah that he was more successful and ambitious than me by using stolen money to create an illusion of wealth and sophistication. Every romantic gesture, every impressive dinner, every expensive gift had been purchased with funds taken from our family's retirement savings. "What's our next step?" I asked. Frank closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. "We file a police report documenting the theft, provide them with all the financial evidence, and request that they freeze Derek's assets pending criminal charges. We also send Derek a formal demand letter requiring him to return all stolen funds within 30 days, and if he doesn't return the money, then he goes to prison for embezzlement. $400,000 in theft from a family business is a felony in this state. Derek's looking at 3 to 5 years if he's convicted." I thought about my brother probably sitting in his apartment trying to figure out how to salvage his situation. Part of me felt sorry for him, the way you might feel sorry for someone who destroyed their own life through poor choices, but mostly I felt relieved that the truth was finally out. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Frank said, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Your grandmother's trust includes provisions for business expansion but only under specific conditions. She wanted Romano's to grow, but she wanted it to grow the right way." He handed me a document I hadn't seen before, another part of my grandmother's carefully planned legacy. She established a separate fund for restaurant expansion, money that can only be used for organic growth that preserves Romano's character and values. No franchising, no corporate partnerships, no compromise of quality or family control. The expansion fund contained nearly $200,000, enough to renovate the kitchen, expand the dining room, and develop the catering services I'd proposed during Friday's meeting. My grandmother had anticipated Derek's ambitions and created an alternative path for growth that aligned with her values instead of undermining them. "She really thought of everything," I said, studying the trust provisions with growing amazement. "Maria Romano was the smartest business person I ever worked with," Frank said simply. "She understood that sustainable success comes from building something valuable, not from extracting maximum profit as quickly as possible." That afternoon we drove to the police station to file formal charges against Derek. The detective who took our statement was thorough and professional, asking detailed questions about the financial evidence and the timeline of Derek's theft. He seemed particularly interested in the shell companies Derek had created, calling them sophisticated financial fraud that suggested premeditation rather than impulsive poor judgment. Cases like this often involve family members who convince themselves they're borrowing rather than stealing, the detective explained. But creating fake companies to disguise theft shows clear criminal intent. Your brother knew exactly what he was doing. As we left the police station, Frank mentioned something that had been troubling him. "Ryan, I'm worried about Derek's reaction when he realizes the full scope of the legal trouble he's facing. People who commit financial crimes sometimes become desperate when they're caught, and desperate people make poor decisions." "What kind of poor decisions?" "Destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, trying to flee the jurisdiction. Derek's already shown he's willing to lie and steal from his own family. I wouldn't put it past him to escalate his behavior if he feels cornered." Frank's warning proved prophetic. That evening as I was closing Romano's, Derek appeared in the dining room like a ghost from my recent past. He looked terrible, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled and stained. His eyes were bloodshot, and he was moving with the jittery energy of someone who hadn't slept in days. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "No, we don't," I replied, continuing to stack chairs on tables. "Any communication between us needs to go through lawyers from now on." Derek laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "Lawyers? Ryan, you're destroying our family over money, over a business disagreement." "I'm protecting our family from a thief," I said calmly. "There's a difference." Derek moved closer and I could smell alcohol on his breath. "You don't understand. The franchising deal would have made everyone rich. The money I borrowed would have been paid back You didn't borrow anything, Derek. You didn't borrow anything, Derek. You stole from our parents. You created fake companies to hide your theft. You spent their retirement savings on jewelry for my former fiancée." Derek's face twisted with anger and frustration. "Sarah understands. She understands that sometimes you have to take risks to build something meaningful. You were never good enough for her." "Maybe not," I said, turning to face him directly. "But at least I never had to steal money to pretend I was successful." Derek's hand tensed into fists. "I could have made Romano's into something special. I could have built an empire that would have lasted for generations. Instead, you're going to keep it small and mediocre forever. I'm going to keep it honest, I replied. I'm going to build something sustainable that serves our community and honors what Grandma created. If that's small and mediocre in your opinion, I can live with that. Derek stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling between rage and desperation. This isn't over, Ryan. I'll find a way to prove that you're working with criminals to steal Romanos from our family. The only criminal in our family is you, Derek. The police have all the evidence they need. Frank Castellano's documentation is thorough and irrefutable. You're going to prison unless you return the money and cooperate with the investigation. Derek turned toward the door, then paused. You actually think you've won something? You think destroying me will give you some kind of satisfaction? I don't need satisfaction, I said quietly. I just need you to stop stealing from our family. Derek left without another word, but something in his expression worried me. Frank had been right about desperate people making poor decisions, and Derek looked very desperate indeed. 2 weeks after Derek's late-night confrontation at Romano's, I was reviewing expansion planning in the office when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, a name I'd deleted and blocked multiple times but that kept reappearing whenever she borrowed someone else's phone. I'd been ignoring her calls for days, but something made me answer this one. Ryan. Her voice was small, uncertain, nothing like the confident woman who'd been planning our wedding just months ago. I need to talk to you. Please don't hang up. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the architectural sketches Frank had helped me commission for Romano's renovation. What do you want, Sarah? Derek's gone, she said quietly. He left town 3 days ago. He cleaned out his apartment, withdrew what money he could from his accounts and disappeared. I think he's running from the police. The news wasn't entirely surprising. Frank had warned me that Derek might try to flee once he realized the full scope of the criminal charge he was facing, but hearing it confirmed still left me with a complicated mix of emotions. Relief that Derek couldn't cause any more immediate damage, disappointment that he'd chosen cowardice over accountability, and worry about what this meant for recovering the stolen money. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Because I think I owe you an apology. A real one, not the shallow excuses I gave you when you caught us together. You don't owe me anything, Sarah. We're done. You made your choice. I made a terrible choice, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I let Derek convince me that you lacked ambition, that you were content to stay small while he was building something meaningful. I believed his lies about your character because I wanted to believe his lies about his own success. I thought about all the expensive dinners Derek had taken her to, all funded by money stolen from my parents' retirement savings, about the jewelry he'd bought her, the weekend trips to wine country, the confident promises about their share, all of it built on theft and deception. Derek was very convincing, I said carefully. He had everyone fooled for a while. I found out about the stolen money last week, Sarah continued. When the police froze his accounts, Derek finally told me the truth about how he'd been funding our relationship. Every nice dinner, every romantic gesture, every expensive gift was purchased with money he stole from your family. The irony was sharp enough to cut. Sarah had left me for a man she thought was more successful and ambitious, only to discover that his success was built entirely on crimes against the people I loved most. I feel like such a fool, Sarah whispered. I threw away something real for something that was completely fake. I hurt you and your family because I was too shallow to see through Derek's lies. I wanted to feel satisfied by her confession, to take some pleasure in her regret and Derek's downfall. But sitting in Romano's office, surrounded by plans for honest growth and sustainable expansion, I found that revenge tasted surprisingly bland. Sarah, I appreciate you calling to tell me about Derek Town. That information will be helpful to the police investigation, but I don't think there's anything else for us to discuss. Ryan, please. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know that I realize what I lost. Derek was exciting and ambitious, but he wasn't kind. He wasn't honest. He didn't have your integrity or your genuine care for other people. You're right, I said simply. You don't deserve forgiveness, not because I'm cruel or vindictive, but because forgiveness isn't something you can demand or earn through apologies. It's something that happens when someone is ready to let go of pain, and I'm not ready yet. Sarah was crying now, soft sounds that carried through the phone like echoes of the woman I'd once planned to marry. I understand. I just wanted you to know that I realized Derek was wrong about you. You weren't the one lacking ambition, you were the one with enough ambition to build something honest, instead of stealing something fake. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet office, thinking about the strange turns my life had taken in the past month. I'd lost a fiancé and a brother, but I'd gained something more valuable: clarity about who I was, and what I wanted to build. Frank arrived an hour later with an update on the criminal investigation. He looked pleased as he settled into the chair across from my desk, pulling a folder from his briefcase. The district attorney is taking Derek's case very seriously, Frank reported. Financial crimes against family businesses are prosecuted aggressively in this county, especially when they involve the kind of sophisticated fraud Derek used to hide his theft. He handed me a document showing the current status of asset recovery efforts. The police have frozen Derek's bank accounts and seized his car, which was purchased with stolen funds. They've also identified most of the shell companies he created, and are working to recover money from those accounts. How much have they recovered so far? About $260,000, with another $100,000 identified in accounts that are still being processed. Derek spent approximately $40,000 on personal expenses over the past 2 years, money that's probably unrecoverable. $360,000 out of $400,000 wasn't perfect, but it was far better than I'd dared hope. When Frank first revealed the scope of Derek's theft, that money would secure my parents' retirement and provide the foundation for Romano's expansion according to my grandmother's vision. What about Derek himself? I asked. Frank's expression grew more serious. He's officially a fugitive now. The warrant was issued yesterday, and his information has been entered into national databases. He can't use credit cards, can't access most of his remaining accounts, and can't travel legally under his own name. Do they think they'll catch him? Eventually. Derek's not a professional criminal, and he doesn't have the skills or resources for a successful life on the run. Most people who flee financial crimes charges are captured within 6 months, usually because they make mistakes that reveal their location. I thought about my brother somewhere out there, probably scared and alone, realizing that his grand ambitions had led him to destroy everything he'd claimed to value. There was justice in his situation, but it felt hollow rather than satisfying. There's something else we need to discuss, Frank said, pulling out another document. Your grandmother's trust includes specific provisions for what happens if family members commit crimes against Romanos or betray the family's values. He handed me a legal document I hadn't seen before, dense with technical language but clear in its intent. Derek's theft and fraud trigger what your grandmother called the betrayal clause. All of his potential inheritance from family assets is permanently forfeited and transferred to you as the trust's sole beneficiary. I studied the document, trying to understand its full implications. What does that mean in practical terms? It means Derek has no legal claim to any part of Romano's, your parents' estate, or any family property. Your grandmother anticipated the possibility that one of her grandchildren might choose greed over family loyalty, and she made sure there would be consequences for that choice. My grandmother's foresight was remarkable. She'd not only protected Romano's from people who might try to exploit it, but she'd also ensured that betrayal would be met with complete disinheritance. Derek hadn't just lost his position at the restaurant, he'd lost any chance of benefiting from the family's success. Frank, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Did you think Derek would end up like this when you first started investigating Romano's finances? Frank considered the question carefully. I hoped I was wrong about Derek. I hoped the irregularities I was finding had innocent explanations, but your grandmother warned me years ago that Derek had what she called hollow ambition. He wanted success and recognition without being willing to do the work or make the sacrifices that real success requires. She saw this coming. She saw the potential for it. Derek always took shortcuts, always looked for easy paths to impressive results. Your grandmother worried that someday those shortcuts would lead him to cross lines he shouldn't cross. I thought about all the times Derek had gotten credit for ideas I'd developed, all the times he'd taken the easy route while I did the difficult work. Those patterns had started in childhood and continued into adulthood, culminating in his decision to steal rather than earn his success. What happens now? I asked. Frank smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from him since we'd started working together. Now you build the Romanos your grandmother envisioned. You use her expansion fund to renovate the restaurant, develop new services and create sustainable growth that serves your community. Over the next 6 weeks, Romano's transformed in ways that honored both its history and its future potential. We expanded the kitchen with modern equipment that allowed us to increase catering volume while maintaining food quality. We renovated the dining room with warm lighting and comfortable seating that preserved the restaurant's family atmosphere while accommodating more customers. The meal kit program I'd proposed proved immediately popular, allowing customers to prepare Romano's signature dishes at home using our pre-portioned ingredients and detailed instructions. The online ordering system connected us with customers throughout the region who wanted authentic Italian food delivered to their homes. Most importantly, we hired 3 new employees who shared our commitment to quality and customer service. Maria, a recent culinary school graduate who specialized in traditional Italian techniques. Carlos, an experienced server who understood that hospitality meant making every customer feel welcome. And Janet, a local marketing coordinator who helped us connect with community organizations and catering clients. My parents threw themselves into the renovation with energy I hadn't seen from them in years. My mother redesigned the front entrance to showcase family photos and customer testimonials that told the story of Romano's place in the community. My father worked with our contractors to ensure every detail met his exacting standards for quality and functionality. We were putting the finishing touches on the renovated dining room when Detective Martinez called with news about Derek's capture. We found him in Phoenix, the detective reported. He was working under a false name at a chain restaurant, living in a weekly motel and trying to save enough money to disappear more permanently. How did you track him down? He made the classic mistake of contacting someone from his old life. Derek called his former business school roommate asking for money, and the roommate contacted us. We had Derek in custody 6 hours later. Derek's arrest meant the legal process could finally move forward. He would be extradited back to our state to face charges of embezzlement, fraud, and theft. With the evidence Frank had compiled, conviction was virtually certain. Derek was looking at 3 to 5 years in prison, plus restitution orders that would require him to repay every penny he'd stolen. Will there be a trial? I asked. Probably not. Derek's attorney is already discussing plea bargain options. With the overwhelming evidence against him, going to trial would only result in a harsher sentence. I felt relieved that the legal uncertainty was ending, but I couldn't muster much satisfaction about Derek's capture. He was my brother, and despite everything he'd done, seeing him face prison time felt more tragic than triumphant. That evening I was closing Romano's when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the county jail, and I knew without answering that Derek was on the other end. Ryan. Derek's voice was hollow, defeated, nothing like the confident man who'd presented his franchising proposal just 2 months ago. I need to talk to you. I'm listening. I want to apologize. Not because my lawyer told me to, not because I'm hoping for leniency, but because I need you to know that I understand what I did to our family. I sat down at one of the newly renovated tables, looking around the dining room that represented everything Derek had tried to steal and destroy. What exactly are you apologizing for? For stealing from Mom and Dad, for betraying your trust, for taking Sarah away from you, and then ruining her life too, for trying to destroy Romano's to feed my own ego and greed. Derek's voice broke slightly. I convinced myself that I was helping the family, that my plans would make everyone wealthy and successful, but the truth is I was just jealous of what you had. With Sarah, jealous of how much Mom and Dad respected your work at Romano's. Jealous that you were content with building something meaningful instead of chasing empty ambitions. Why are you telling me this now? Because sitting in this jail cell, I finally understand the difference between success and accomplishment. You built something real with Romano's. You earned people's respect through honest work and genuine care. I tried to steal success without earning it, and I destroyed everything that actually mattered. I thought about the months of planning and hard work that had gone into Romano's renovation, about the satisfaction of seeing customers enjoy meals prepared with care and integrity. Derek was right about the difference between success and accomplishment, even if he'd learned it too late to matter. I accept your apology. I hope you use your time in prison to figure out who you want to be when you get out. I will, Derek said quietly. And Ryan, take care of Romano's. Make it everything Grandma dreamed it could be. 3 months later, Romano's reopened with a celebration that filled every seat in our expanded dining room. Regular customers mixed with new faces drawn by our enhanced menu and improved atmosphere. Local business leaders came to support a restaurant that had proven its commitment to the community. Families gathered around tables where multiple generations had celebrated milestones and created memories. Frank Castellano sat at the corner booth where he'd eaten dinner with my grandmother 50 years ago, watching the bustling restaurant with obvious satisfaction. My parents moved through the dining room greeting customers like old friends, their faces glowing with pride and renewed purpose. I worked in the open kitchen where customers could watch meals being prepared with care and attention to detail. Every dish represented the values my grandmother had instilled in our family: quality ingredients, traditional techniques, and genuine hospitality that made people feel welcome and valued. As the evening wound down and the last customers headed home with satisfied smiles and full stomachs, I stood in the dining room thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. I'd lost a fiancé who didn't share my values and a brother who'd chosen greed over family loyalty, but I'd gained something more valuable: clarity about what success really meant and confidence in my ability to build something lasting and meaningful. Sarah had been wrong about my ambitions. I was ambitious, but my ambitions were focused on creating value rather than extracting profit, on building community rather than accumulating wealth, on honoring the past while embracing sustainable growth. The restaurant didn't need to become a franchise empire to be successful. It needed to remain true to its values while evolving to serve its community better. Growth for growth's sake was hollow. Growth that enhanced quality and expanded service was meaningful. As I turned off the lights and locked the door of Romano's, I thought about my grandmother's trust documents and the responsibility they represented. She'd entrusted me with more than a restaurant. She'd entrusted me with a legacy of honest work, family loyalty, and community service. I'd protected that legacy from people who would have destroyed it for personal gain. Now I had the opportunity to build on it, to create something even better while staying true to the values that made it special in the first place. The next morning brought news that Derek had accepted a plea bargain, requiring him to serve 2 years in prison and pay full restitution for his theft. It was a fair resolution that held him accountable, while offering him a chance to rebuild his life when he was released. I hoped Derek would use his time in prison wisely. But what Derek chose to do with his future, Romano's would continue serving our community with the honesty and quality my grandmother had always demanded. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction or punishment. Sometimes it's simply building something so good and so true that it makes the betrayal irrelevant. Derek had tried to steal Romano's legacy, but he'd only succeeded in proving how valuable that legacy really was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.